Thank you for coming, and everybody. This is the last act. So,
right.
So I thought that in the tradition that we've adopted, I would just read a little something, and then Ed and I will talk a bit. Now, this is when I first went to China in 1976, and I was writing for The New Yorker. I got home and was writing this book, and Mao Zedong died. And I was contemplating what that meant. And I have to say, as I go back and look at my work, many of my contemplations weren't exactly accurate prognostications about the future. But here, try this one on for size, and then we can talk about it. So, for many people who watched, China without a Mao seemed barely conceivable. The endless statues of Mao, the chanting of his name, the posters, the red books, even memorabilia like red cigarette lighters emblazoned with Mao quotes seemed to suggest to onlookers that China might be a country so firmly rooted by one charismatic personality that it might never survive his demise. While in Beijing, I'd often pass the brilliant crimson and gold gates of Zhongnanhai, where Mao lived, and even then wondered what it would feel like someday for a Chinese to pass by these high walls, knowing that their chairman Mao no longer lived. For most Chinese today, there is no memory of Mao. But while trying to imagine this Mao-less China, I was struck in a very forceful way by the fact that even prior to death, Mao had transcended his own personality. He was no passing rock star, no movie idol, or even a John Kennedy, who once taken from our midst was gone. For Mao had transformed his being, even his personality, into a series of carefully thought out and organized ideas. Mao was a thinker as well as a doer. He conceived of the Chinese Revolution and then helped and caused it to happen. And then, in the process, the thought of Chairman Mao became almost inculcated in almost every Chinese. The word, it seemed, had almost literally become flesh. And it seemed clear, even before Mao died, that his death could not erase the way in which he had almost become transubstantiated in his people. Now, is that true? Over to you, Ed.
I think that we're in an era in China now where clearly the cult of Mao has faded away into the past, and and up until Xi Jinping came to power, people believed that at least the Chinese leadership knew that they had to move away from this personality-driven model of governing China. I think Xi Jinping has brought that into question again. And some people, including some of my journalist peers, have written that there's a cult of personality being formed around Xi, or that Xi and the propaganda apparatus are trying to promote this. I'm not sure I exactly buy that. I think that the level of sort of hero worship and the following that Xi has is very different than what Mao has. I don't think, even with his small attempts at making himself into this representation, first of what he called the China dream or the Chinese dream, and then now of something even bigger than that. I think maybe something about China's emergence onto the global stage. I think that those representations still cast him in a way as an ordinary leader, although one who's willing to break the norms. So I think that Mao himself has faded. There are factions within China that are trying to revive some of the philosophies, and we call them the New Left. And even Xi himself might feel some pressure from them. But I think in general that era is gone, and I don't think, whatever one wants to think about the current leadership, I don't think that's coming back.
Before Ed ended up in Beijing, he spent, 5 years in Iraq?
Right. 4 years.
4 years.
Right.
So that was quite a transition. And I'm curious, Ed, just from your perspective, I mean, you've been there intensely for the last, 5, 6 years?
Yeah, 8 years in Beijing.
Has it been 8 years?
Yeah, it's a long time.
Amazing.
Well, what's funny is I started, right before I went to Beijing, I came here to the Asia Society to see you because I think this Arthur Ross Center is just starting. You just started.
What did I tell you?
And you told me just to take notes of everything, not just the immediate story that I'm working on. And so you were playing the mentor role even then while you're starting the center for me.
Let me ask you this. In those 8 years, how has your sort of thinking about the sort of trajectory of China changed?
It's hard to tell. I'm trying, like one thing at the end of my time in China, I think one thing that I concluded was that it's impossible to really make conclusions about where China is heading. I think that one thing I did think was that too often journalists and maybe other people who write about China tend to frame things in terms of the legitimacy of the party. I think oftentimes I can probably show you like 10 or a dozen stories I've written where somewhere in what we call the nut graph, we say, oh, this might bring into question the legitimacy of the party for many Chinese. But after having traveled around China to many corners of it, I'd have to say that that party rule is fairly strong in terms of sort of the way that the people have faith in the central government. I think that many Chinese have faith in the top leaders, the people who are in Zhongnanhai. And even though they complain about local officials, and the party leadership knows about these complaints, many Chinese will not question whether the party is bringing the country in the right direction, or at least has the best interests of the country at heart.
And is it surprising to you that this structure, which was basically laid down in the 1950s, still coheres and still, as you point out, maintains a certain loyalty, discipline, and is actually quite functional?
Right, but as we know, that it underwent sort of radical changes during that time. So, the break between Mao and Deng, and then 89 was a break, and then afterwards, the jump-starting of reforms again by Deng and pushing forth that. So I think that, some people have called it adaptive authoritarianism, and that the party had been able to adapt, and now we're at another point where it's a testing period for the party, and whether it can push China forward, mostly in terms of some changes to the economic model. I don't think people are questioning whether there will be changes or significant changes to political model. I think that 10 years ago, maybe my predecessors, that would have been a question that they kept asking themselves when they were covering China. But I think now if you ask any serious journalist in China or anyone studying China, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who's really looking at whether there is serious political change about to take place within the ranks of the party.
You think that we probably won't see serious political change?
Well, I think that we would be... so this is where we're getting to predictions. So I think that it's more likely that it'll end up being status quo for a long period of time, say. I think that they've proven themselves to be adaptive enough, and that the systems of control that they've put in place in China, whether you're talking about propaganda, the propaganda apparatus, including control of things like the internet, to the security apparatus in places like Western China, where you see more protests. These are firmly entrenched, and they're growing more canny each year.
I think from our sort of Western perspective, and we all carry that with us when we go to China, you could say that the system there really shouldn't work, and yet it has.
Right.
And I think we've waited. We thought, well, there's a structural instability here, there's one there, there's this, that, and the other. And yet, here we are, 2017, and it's still going. And for someone like me, who watched the whole of 1989, when it seemed impossible that they would ever get the genie back in the bottle, they did.
And what do you attribute that to?
I mean, I think partially to Deng Xiaoping's incredible agility, that he, in a certain sense, was not sort of committed to fundamental political reform, but did understand economic reform and could balance that incredible discontinuity. I mean, it's still counterintuitive to me.
Right. And one thing, I mean, implicit in your question is the idea that we sort of, as Western observers of China, I think a lot of observers throughout the decades and the centuries have, in a way, wondered whether China will follow certain models that have been established in the West. And I'm wondering why you think, and I feel, instinctually, I feel that Americans and maybe other Westerners feel that way about China more than other countries in other parts of the world. Why do you think that people hold China up as this potential mirror to their own country, and that they wish there's a longing or a wish that the China model might sort of follow in the path of a more Western model, only for people to be disappointed time and again?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, as well as I think this is sort of the American, sort of a unique quality to our evangelical personalities, that whether we are Christians spreading the gospel, capitalists spreading the market, or Democrats spreading the idea of the city on the hill, we do have this notion of our infinite rightness, that we're on. Clinton said it. He said to Jiang Zemin, he said, "You're on the wrong side of history. That history is going in a direction. We're on the right side. Everybody else sooner or later will come around. And we just a question of a few more ballet troops, a little more educational exchange, open those markets, and we'll get there." But I'm not so sure. Are you?
Right. I'm not so sure, and I think that, but there's still something about, I don't think Americans have the same missionary zeal for all parts of the world. I think there's something about China that brings this out in them, and I'm trying to...
Well, you're Chinese.
Right.
What do you think?
Well, I'm Chinese, but I was born here, so I'll have to say. Plus, my parents are Cantonese, so we can say...
Does that discount them from...
Right. We can discuss the various regional differences.
But I mean, I think it's fair to say that you don't see the Japanese acting this way.
Right.
Even the British, they just wanted to sell opium.
Right.
You know, there was, and maybe, Peter, I'm sorry, maybe spread a little...
They did bring some clocks over. They brought some clocks over to the palace.
Yeah, but I do think that there was something about China that was at once, I mean, it's this curious attraction, repulsion, love-hate relationship that Chinese and Americans have had. We're at once incredibly close, and yet we're incredibly sort of, we struggle and fight a lot as well.
So what phase of the relationship do you think we're entering right now?
Well, dear me, I'd have to say that I think we are going into quite a fraught period where the antagonisms between the countries threaten to overwhelm the attraction and the sort of the love, part of the love-hate relation. I mean, this is oscillating pulse. And I'm not sure exactly how our president's policies will come to play into that, but it's very dangerous.
Right. I remember a few years ago you came to China, and I think you were prescient in this. This was before the Obama administration really pushed climate change as the main thing that China and the U.S. could work together on. You had, here at the Asia Society, used that project as a model for maybe an issue that the two countries could work together on. And now that's falling by the wayside.
And yet it did come almost to term.
Right.
The U.S. and China really did get together.
Yeah, they did. They gained momentum under the last years of the Obama administration. So that's why
a classic case of actually, I mean, in the first years when we were first there lofting, we did this report with Steve Chu, who became the Secretary of Energy, saying this is the perfect opportunity for the U.S. and China to collaborate. You know, there's no antagonisms. It's all win-win. And the initial reaction was, well, you Westerners are just trying to foist the carbon burden off on us. You've pumped a great historical burden up there. Now you want us to be equal share in the solution. Don't think so. We need to develop. But actually, things changed. And we did become, I think, got to the precipice of becoming equal partners. And now,
right,
all of that is in jeopardy because of what's going on in Washington.
And how important is it to find these projects, these very specific concrete projects that these two countries can work together on?
I mean, what else can you do? I mean, that's why we had that nice concert. You know, if you can't agree on policy, let's just at least sing together. I I think it's really important, and I think, I know you understand this, Ed, better than I. You sat in Beijing for 8 years. I mean, I think when it's precisely at those times when governments begin to have strained relations that we rely on that sort of system of contacts that exists in the non-governmental world. It becomes, in a curious way, more important because it sustains the relationship in important ways.
Right.
I mean, I don't think it's enough. But well, tell me, as you are contemplating the meaning of life off in Princeton now and don't have these daily burdens of writing and running the bureau, how do you see the future of China? You can make a prediction if you want, but are you optimistic?
It's interesting that people always talk about it in terms of optimistic or pessimistic. I mean, I think that I would say, if I had to choose a word, it would be optimistic because I think the country will remain fairly stable. I don't think that it's, if we're using sort of 20th century China as the benchmark, then we're a long ways away from that. We're a long ways away from mid-20th century China. And I think that there will be increasing prosperity for a certain segment of the Chinese, and that those people will then be able to go abroad. They'll be able to send their children to good schools overseas. Their preference will be for overseas schools, and that they will be in a way sort of ambassadors for their country. And there will be this increasing urbanization in China where people will come to the cities and think that there's a chance they can realize certain dreams, I think, in the cities, even if the reality of that is somewhat different.
Do you worry about the South China Sea, East China Sea?
It depends on who's being appointed to various positions at any given week. So it changes. Like, it's changed week by week right now as I watch American
on our
politics.
side?
On our side, yeah. I do think that, like reading certain things like sort of some of the things that Steve Bannon has said, it seems like that he's looking for, some people are looking for civilizational conflict.
And how do you think Chinese, when they read Brother Bannon, what do you think they think? What are they making of it?
I don't know. We should ask them at some point. Maybe
I'm
some
not sure
people in this room might.
They may not know any better than we do what to make of it.
Right. So, South China Sea, I know, is a big issue. And it reached very tense moments in the last few years, I think, when I was there in Beijing covering this and other issues. We saw the Chinese putting the oil rig in Vietnamese waters, and then and obviously the building up of these low tide elevation features into what the Chinese claim are islands. So I think that I don't think that there's an easy solution for that, and I think that the big debate within is going to be within American policy circles about whether you sort of cede that territory to China. I know that various thinkers here in the U.S. have said China has the right to have their own Monroe Doctrine. Like the U.S. has their Monroe Doctrine, and they put it in place at a time when it made sense for the Western Hemisphere, and now it's China's time in the East.
So, of course, the Caribbean didn't have Japan next to it.
Right. So it's much more complicated.
Yeah. So let me ask you a final question, and I'll even hazard an answer afterwards. How do you think Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are going to get along?
Well, I don't know. Maybe if Xi Jinping takes up golf, they'll play around.
Yeah, I mean, that's coming up.
Right.
Yeah.
It is. I think these are two big personalities, and I think that Xi is has probably studied. I assume she has studied Trump, and I'm not sure I can say that about the other way around. But I think that I think that the buttons that they can push might be fairly obvious, and we've already seen Trump retreat from sort of his putting the one China policy on the table. We've seen him retreat from that, and obviously something was said behind the scenes that forced him to take a step back. It could be something like the fact that they need to work together in North Korea, or it could be other issues. But I think that the Chinese leadership probably knows that Trump is brash, and that because of that, there's this certain level at which he can be played.
Yeah, I think particularly if they're smart and offer him a big deal.
Right.
And,
right.
I think
they're very good at deals.
Very good at deals. And, really lather on the pomp and ceremony,
right.
and then say, you and I settle things.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
I could imagine that actually something would happen that would be game changing. But on the other hand, I can imagine the opposite.
Right. I don't imagine a trade war, but I imagine that there might be sort of some reciprocity on certain economic issues.
Yeah.
I could see that happening.
Yeah. Well, listen, you've all been very indulgent, and we've kept you long past your bed hours. So with that, I want to thank Ed and thank all of you and everyone else who participated in this gala. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Orville.